It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
I'm not coming back with more borrowing or more taxes. And that is why, at this budget, we did wipe the slate clean.
Big promise from the Chancellor. Will she be able to keep it?
If you don't have basic skills, or if you're out of work when you're young, the consequences can be lifelong.
Can Labour get the jobless back to work?
We're not leaving our house. We're not leaving our house. We're not leaving our house.
The margins are getting squeezed to the extent that it's getting to the point that it's not worth it.
The woes of renting and letting in Scotland. We'll ask the SNP's Westminster leader what's going wrong. And what is the definition of a woman? Joining us today, Education Minister Catherine McKinnell, Conservative MP Andrew Mitchell, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn, and writer and broadcaster Timandra Harkness. This is Politics Live. Hello, let's start with the front page of the Daily Mail, echoing what Rachel Reeves said, as you heard in the headlines. No more tax rises, insists the Chancellor. Yes, she promises that the budget was a one-off in terms of tax rises and borrowing. Is she to be believed, Catherine?
So the Chancellor was obviously talking to a business audience yesterday, and I think she was right to be really clear that this is a once-in-a-Parliament budget. It was a really challenging budget. I know you've discussed at length the circumstances leading to it, the inherited challenging finances that were discovered on coming into government that genuinely were not properly understood before, and that's been well established.
We have discussed it ad infinitum, but my question is, and you actually pointed that she was talking to businesses, Rachel Reeves. So is she saying no more tax rises on business in any future budget, or no more tax rises and borrowing at all?
So clearly, there will be budgets every year. We have spending review coming up in the spring. We need to work out within the budget that has been set for each department how those spending decisions will be established. But I think the fundamental point she's making is that we needed to set the budget straight in order to build on much stronger foundations going forward, rebuild our public services, ensure we have growth in the economy and the confidence to invest.
But should people believe Rachel Reeves when she says it was a one-off and I won't come back for more?
We recognise a significant ask that has been made of businesses as well in terms of the national insurance increase. And that we recognise that this is a shared load to really rebuild our economy, rebuild our country, and invest in public services, which ultimately will benefit businesses and will help our economy to grow.
My question is she to be believed? Can you believe Rachel Reeves when she says, I won't come back for more tax rises and borrowing?
Well, I mean, your question to my friend and colleague here put it very well. What does it actually mean, what she said? Is she talking about business taxes? Is she talking about personal taxes? I think she has two big problems. The first is that, on the whole, chancellors shouldn't actually fetter themselves so directly, even though I don't think we can tell precisely what she means. But secondly, no one's going to believe her anyway, because the Labour Party were adamant during the election that they weren't going to put up taxes. I went round my constituency saying dogs bark, cats meow, and Labour puts up taxes. And so it has proved. So I think it's a pretty meaningless statement, and I don't think it will give confidence to business or individuals in the somewhat scattergun approach this government is taking.
Is Rachel Reeves to be believed when she says this was a one-off budget in terms of tax rises and borrowing?
Well, if she's to be believed, which I think is up for debate, then what that means is that in 2026 we're going to have a return to austerity, because whatever way the cookie crumbles, Rachel Reeves is boxing herself in. She's saying that we're not going to have anything on income tax, on VAT, on corporation tax, on national insurance taxes, any taxes on business whatsoever. So what she's relying upon is growth. But of course, the OBR is telling us that there's not going to be any growth. And when we look at the underlying picture,
there'll be a bit.
But when we're looking at the underlying picture of the UK economy, Rachel Reeves is refusing to even discuss migration. She's refusing to even discuss the single market, the customs union, where you can get big pots of growth very quickly, very easily. So Is this a budget which has worked? No. I think she's lost the dressing room, to be quite honest.
She's lost?
She's lost the room. She was in with the business community yesterday, who she'd obviously tried to woo in advance of the election, who are now looking at her saying, you broke your promises to us, and now as a result, working people are going to be impacted.
Tamandra?
Well, I think one of the problems is the idea was that the economy would grow, it'd be a growth economy, and then that would fill in the gaps in tax to give the public spending. But certainly if businesses are to be believed, and it seems very plausible, the particular taxes that she has brought in are actually going to make growth very difficult, because they're going to make it very difficult to hire, especially part-time, low-paid people. They're going to make it very difficult for businesses to invest for the future and so on. So, I mean, that's the real crux of it, is this budget going to allow the growth that is supposedly going to finance the rest of the Parliament?
Well, you've talked about the pressures on businesses in terms of hiring. Let's talk about jobs. BBC News headline, Starmer, Prime Minister says UK isn't working as he announces jobs push. It's one of the biggest challenges that's been identified by the government, and that's getting more people into work. The government's unveiled a policy document, or white paper, as we say, in the trade to try and address the very steep rises in the number of people out of work due to ill health. Catherine, the press release for this announcement says these reforms will be underlined by the principle that people who can work will be expected to work with clear consequences. What are those clear consequences?
Well, can I just say, in terms of the economy, I think this is all a bit doom and gloom. I think we've had years of stagnant growth and total chaos, really, in our political system, which I think has really hampered investment and growth in this country. So, you know, I think we have a Chancellor for the first time that has put the economy on a really stable footing and is really determined to make the long-term decisions.
Well, we'll be the judge of that. We will judge this government by the results. On that here, what are the clear consequences?
I mean, obviously, we have, I mean, a devastating statistic. The 1 in 8 young people, sort of 18 to 21-year-olds, not in work or training. And so we're absolutely determined not to abandon young people to what can be a really stifling period in your life. It should be a springboard to the future.
No one will disagree with you on that.
Aren't there,
no one will disagree with the principles that you're setting out, Catherine. What I'm trying to get to is what you're directly... Well, don't deflect. What are the clear consequences that if people who can work are expected to work, and if they don't, there will be clear consequences? Those are the words on the press release. What are they? OK,
but you say that everyone agrees, but actually the support for young people to actually get themselves into work and in opportunities have not been there. So the consequences have always been there, which is if you receive out-of-work benefits and out-of-work support, then, and if you don't undertake the steps necessary to get yourself into work, then the consequences flow from that you lose entitlement to your benefits.
So there are no new consequences?
What is new is the support that is going to be put in place to support young people to actually get on in whatever starting point of their job, career, life they're going to be getting into. And I think that's the real fundamental shift here. And obviously the paper has just been literally produced and published today at lunchtime. So I'm sure there'll be lots of debate. And that's the point. This is a consultation because we're really keen to work with businesses and with the young people affected as well to make sure that we get this right for the long term.
Is this going to work, Stephen?
So just to reflect a bit major on what's been said there, if this was a Conservative press release, if this was a Conservative tactic, then Catherine would be absolutely outraged. She'd be in the House of Commons demanding that the UK government don't do this, because this is what governments always do. When they're in a sticky spot, they go after the people who have the least, instead of addressing the big fundamental problems which lead to people not being in work and living in poverty.
So you'd have no sanctions? If it was your decision, you'd have no sanctions on anybody that continually refused to go to work?
So we have a social security system in Scotland where we, of course, have responsibility for some devolved benefits, and every single person who's looked at that has said that we deal with things in a compassionate manner. This isn't compassionate. This is exactly what the UK establishment does. It goes after the poorest in society. Instead of addressing the big fundamentals in the UK economy, which has been driven, particularly for young people, by austerity, by Brexit, by COVID. My entire working life, my entire adult life has been dominated by the UK economy failing.
Right,
And
well,
that's why young people are in a terrible
Catherine,
position.
do you want to respond?
Well, yeah, I would agree. We've seen years
but
of
respond
young people
to
being
the criticism
failed. But
by
that's the point
Stephen.
he's making, that young people have been failed. And we know that during COVID, the COVID recovery plan was abandoned. It wasn't seen as good value for money. And we are reaping the consequences of that for young people that are out of work, out of options, out of opportunities. And that's why, for example, I'm at the Department for Education. We call ourselves the Department for Opportunity because we know that creating those opportunities start at a much younger age and right throughout a child's life. We want every young person to get through their education ready for life and ready for work, and it will take time. But in the meantime, we want to invest in the support in job centres, put a youth guarantee in place.
You must agree. Let's hear from the Conservative representative. You would agree with everything that the government is saying. I mean, even though we don't know what these clear consequences are going to be beyond the consequences that were going to be in place under the previous Tory government, and if you'd won the election, presumably you support all of this.
Well, first of all, let's be clear that Sir Keir said the defining mission of his government was to create growth. And then we saw a government which had exactly the opposite effect. All the independent forecasters said, as a result of the budget, there will be less growth than there was before. And under us, growth came back to some significant extent.
Well,
but also on every day of the last
it was after about 12 years of anemic growth.
The last Conservative government saw 800 new jobs created. So you know, I think that we can always do better. And on the issue of the white paper, I wish Lucy Powell well. I hope very much that she will be successful.
Yeah. So you do agree with it?
No, I think she's absolutely right to say that there are far too many people who could be in work who are not, and we need to support them to get back into work. But if you want to get people back into work, why do you run an economy where, as everyone at the CBI conference said yesterday, there will be less jobs as a result of the policies pursued by this government? So we have got to get back a sense of order. Before COVID struck, the public sector was very much smaller than it is today. We have to go back to the logic which says that
you would like to see a much smaller state then?
What I would like to see is some recognition of the fact that the state has not gone back to the size it should have been after COVID.
Well, just one thing, what would you stop the government doing? To get to that smaller state, what should the government stop doing?
Well, I mean, what is the government doing now that it wasn't doing before COVID, with so many more civil servants and people involved?
So it's just about cutting civil servants.
That is the real question you have to ask.
I mean, Tamandra, listening to all of this, we've been struggling all morning as a team on Politics Live to work out exactly what is being proposed here. Is it about these consequences that are the same, as Catherine has said, that already existed? Is there anything new in this policy, or is it more about encouragement and helping people back into work? Because the numbers are enormous in terms of people who are off work because of sickness.
Well, who knows? And I think, the sickness thing is a big part of this, and the problem of people being off work, long-term sick, often with chronic conditions and mental health conditions, has been growing and growing and growing for, 20, 30 years. But the one thing that nobody is really addressing is one of the things that has impacted this generation of young people is what we did to them during COVID, is when we closed the schools and universities went online and there were lockdowns, and during the very time when young people should have been developing their social skills and developing, growing into young people and the fullness of education, not just online content delivery, they were being locked up at home in spite of the illness being really absolutely no threat to their health at all. And the Labour Party were very gung-ho for that. The Labour Party, if anything, was saying you should be locking down more, you should be shutting the schools earlier. Yes, and we are seeing the consequences of this for a whole generation of people.
As politicians, do you want to take responsibility for that?
Turn around and say, we got that wrong and we're sorry.
So there is an inquiry ongoing which will report and come up with conclusions on that. I think people have very selective memories about that period. I'm a mother of young children, and I remember that there were difficulties around getting to school because the teachers all had COVID and were unwell. And I think people are confusing the period post-vaccine with the period pre-vaccine and some of the different choices that were made during that period, which is why I think the inquiry is really important to get to the bottom of that.
No, I'm
but I
sorry.
also think it's a complete distraction.
Some of us said from the start,
because
you should not shut schools. It's disproportionate.
We are an
Don't
outlier.
shout over each other. Let Tamandra, and I'll come back to you.
Well, no, I haven't finished my point, though. We are an outlier in the G7
Whoa.
at sluggish regrowth in young people getting back into work and people getting back into work post-pandemic. So there is something very particular about the way the last government has let people down in terms of recovery post.
Well, let Tamandra respond, and then I'll come to you too.
Some of us said right from the start, closing schools is disproportionate. It's going to have a terrible impact on young people. It doesn't do anything to protect the young people. And a lot of us were shouted down. And another thing that some of us said, I sat in this very seat during COVID and we discussed whether the next election would be won or lost on how well the government had handled COVID. And I said, no, it won't. It will be on the economic situation that is going to follow COVID, which is going to be absolutely terrible. And
we need to look.
Well, hang on, Stephen, do you want to take responsibility for the policies that were undertaken that have led to, as Tamandra sees it, the ongoing mental health crisis with young people?
I think there's a huge amount of revisionism going on here, and I don't think that's helpful at all, and I think it's quite disingenuous, to be honest. And this notion that the only way schools operate is because people go into them. You still have teachers, you still have janitors, you still have all the PSAs who go in, who are adults, who have responsibilities, who have people they may be caring for, who have people who may have chronic lung diseases in their homes. Should they not have been in a position where they were safe as well? Absolutely, they should have. So the government took the right decisions. But I think to focus just on COVID also does us disservice to our young people, because as I said earlier, young people have grown up over the course of the last 18 or so years in the UK, having to deal with austerity, Brexit and COVID, and indeed the challenges of technology. Well, all of that together has been devastating for them.
Andrew, what's your view?
So let me make... I mean, I agree with Stephen about the suffering of the younger generation as a result of COVID. And I think we've seen it in a whole series of ways. So I agree with that. But let me make 2 points, which I hope people will accept. First is that and I wish this programme well, I hope Labour is successful in reversing the number of people who are out of work and getting them back into the labour market. I hope they are successful. But
that's not the person you want to be thanking.
If you're going to do that, then you have to have a strategy. And a strategy requires growth and jobs. And as we heard repeatedly from the CBI yesterday, and it's on all the front pages, Labour's policies are going to have the reverse effect. The other point I'd like to make is this. I think we've got to come to a point now that we accept that you cannot go on trying to get a quart out of a pint pot. We've got to recognise, and I hope that my party will do this during its period in opposition, that we've got to work out what the state must do and what the state can do, and what is a reasonable level of taxation, because we cannot go on as a country wanting low-tax American policies and high social provision of the Scandinavian model.
All right. This might be one of the subjects that comes up at Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow when we're on at the earlier time of 11:15. Do join me then to see Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, take on the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Now, let's just show you some pictures or the scene inside the Supreme Court at the moment, because there is a case being considered today, which is the culmination of a battle about the legal definition of a woman. The issue being considered by the court is whether a person with a full gender recognition certificate, which recognises that their gender is female, is a woman for the purposes of the Equality Act. We can talk to our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon, who is at the Supreme Court. Lorna, give us a bit more detail about what this case is about.
Yeah, it's been a long-running legal battle in Scotland, goes way back to 2018. It was all to do with female representation on boards and an act passed by the Scottish ministers, the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood, where they, in effect, said that people with a gender recognition certificate could be counted as women for the purposes of representation on boards. It was fought in the Court of Session by a campaign group for Women Scot. They won that first round. The Scottish Government went back and changed the wording of the bill. They won that second round, so it's ended up back here in front of Supreme Court judges for a definitive ruling on whether that Scottish Government guidance that sex can be modified by a gender recognition certificate, that a transgender woman with a gender recognition certificate, so who was registered male at birth, is a woman. and entitled to sex-based protections under the Equality Act, which of course is a reserved matter. Interesting arguments being made in court this morning. It started off with the KC for Women Scott. He gets to spend most of today putting forward his arguments. He says the wider context is patriarchy. He pointed out that most of the lawyers in court today are men, that most of the judges on the bench who are going to decide what is a woman are men. And he said that women, for Women Scott, in effect, and the arguments they are making, is that sex is a biological fact, that it is determined by one's body. It's an immutable biological fact. His arguments will continue. The Scottish Government gets to make their arguments. Scottish ministers get to make their arguments tomorrow.
What are the potential implications of the ruling, or any ruling?
Well, campaigners who've brought this appeal say the potential implications are huge. They say if they don't win this appeal, it will impact on same-sex spaces like shelters, like rape crisis centres, like hospital wards. They say that transgender men, so men who were registered female at birth, will lose sex-based pregnancy rights under the Equality Act. They also say that lesbians will lose the right to gather and will, as a class, and will have to allow what they would call natal men, so transgender women who were registered male at birth, entry. Men who they say would, under the law as it's been defined by the Scottish Government, would be considered lesbians. I mean, it's phenomenally complex stuff, but they say that the implications of this are huge. And of course, on the other side, transgender campaigners say that if the appeal is upheld and For Women Scott win, that it will have big implications for their rights and gender recognition protections as well.
Lorna Gordon, thank you very much. Stephen, do you stand by your position that a gender recognition certificate can be used for all purposes under the Equality Act?
And this is what the court is going to be determining today, and I wouldn't seek to preempt the outcome of the Supreme Court in that context.
Well, you won't be, but that was your position.
Obviously, what the court's looking at, as your correspondent has outlined there, is the guidance which exists in relation to public bodies. Now, the bigger debate which exists here, which I assume we may well get onto, is something which has been quite fervent on both sides, and there's very strongly held views. I'm very conscious in that debate and in that discussion that we don't lose sight of the fact that there's a huge number of women who are deeply concerned, but there's also a huge number of trans men and women who are deeply concerned as well. And I immediately come to the conversation, the very brief conversation I had with Brianna Gay's mother just a matter of months ago in the Commons, thanks to the assistance of Angela Rayner for allowing me the opportunity to do so. And when we are discussing these things, I think we all need to remember that the heat that exists doesn't have to permeate into all aspects of the discussion.
No, but as you say, it's being discussed in court, and I'm just trying to establish that you still very much stand by the position that was put forward that a gender recognition certificate can be used for all purposes under the Equality Act.
And of course, that's what the Scottish Government, as I understand it, is defending within the court today.
Right. So
and
what
like
do you say?
Everyone, I'll see what the outcome of the Supreme Court judgment is in that respect.
Right, but what implications, or you heard some of the potential implications, could this have on single-sex spaces? And how would the Scottish Government deal with protecting people in single-sex spaces?
Well, of course, I wouldn't want to preempt the outcome of the Supreme Court. So
by the way, we've spoken to our lawyers. There's no risk of contempt of court or sub judice or anything like that. So you are entitled to state. You're not going to influence.
No, I know.
Important though you are.
No. I'm very well aware of the fact that I'm not going to influence outcome, but I wouldn't want to preempt the outcome, because you're asking me to make a position on something.
But you must have thought about it.
The government will have to respond to whichever position the Supreme Court adopts and pose that upon the
so
law.
Do you accept there could be implications, serious implications for single-sex spaces and how they should run those?
As your correspondent has quite rightly outlined there could be significant implications for people who are women and people indeed who are trans women or trans men as well.
Timandra, wouldn't ruling against the Scottish Government and the position broadly held here by Stephen Flynn erode the rights of trans people living in their reassigned gender? And some equalities groups have called this the thin end of the wedge, to quote them, on other rights.
Well, I don't think so, as far as I understand the case, because the status quo at the moment is that the Equality Act says you can't discriminate against someone on the grounds of protected characteristics, including sex. So in most circumstances, I couldn't exclude Stephen from things because he's a man if I would let him in if he was a woman. But the Equality Act does say there are certain exceptions to this if they're proportionate and for a good reason. So if it was a single-sex, as you say, rape shelter or a hospital ward or something, then that would be reasonably proportionate. We say, no, sorry, this is for women and you can't come in because you're a man. So the problem arises is if Stephen said, no, actually, I want to live as a woman, I have my gender recognition certificate, so I would like you to treat me as a woman in all circumstances, then what this is clarifying is in what circumstances do we say, yes, but sorry, you're still biologically a man, and so we're still going to reasonably and proportionately exclude you because you're a man, even though your gender recognition certificate says you're a woman for other social purposes. And we really do need to clarify this because there are lots of everyday situations. I have trans friends who are like, I want my passport, my driving licence to say the gender in which I live, not the gender I was born in, because I don't want to have to go through life saying, yes, I know it says female and I have a beard and this is why. But there are cases where sex is really, really important. And however strongly somebody feels that they inside are the other sex, their actual biological sex matters. And that those protections, we need to say, why is this division here? Why is this sex segregated? Is it, to be honest, the original case, which was quotas for people on boards, personally, I am not supportive of those things, but that's a separate discussion. You need to say, why is this separation here? If sports, for example, are separated by sex and not by some other category like gender, why is that? Well, in sport, it's because male performance and female performance is so very, very different that women would just never win anything.
Stephen?
I think in terms of going back to the premise of the argument, we are talking about public bodies and public boards and guidance which exists within that. Now, is there going to be further implications as a result of the ruling on other aspects of life? That's to be determined, and that's obviously for the government to understand once the court's given its ruling. And I think that for all of us across the UK who are having this debate and this discussion, we need to see what the court says and see how that frames the wider debate and the wider laws that we have. Yeah,
but there's already been a number of examples of real-life experiences for public bodies who have accused politicians, not you directly, but politicians of all flavours, of a lack of direction and leadership on this particular issue. Police Scotland criticised politicians in Westminster and Edinburgh for not having proper guidance on this. So you are passing the buck to the courts, aren't you, to help with the guidance that you had already issued so that bodies like Police Scotland have an idea exactly what you're talking about?
Well, with all due respect, I don't think the government has passed the buck to the court. Someone's taken legal action, which is why it's ended up in the court, and I don't think we can escape from that fact. But should the court be able to determine its position, and should the government then respect what the court has said? Of course it should. Now, in that wider context, I do think it's important that all of us reflect upon the discussion that we're having, the fact that there's real people who sit behind this, and then the government will have to respond accordingly.
Right. Catherine, Labour's manifesto promised to simplify and reform the gender recognition process, removing indignities. Are there any plans to reform that process now you're in government?
So, just to say, first of all, it's really important that the Equality Act is in place to protect people with protected characteristics, and we absolutely support and uphold the Equality Act. And I think Tamandra gave a good explanation as to why it's very important that these protected characteristics are recognised in the way that public bodies deliver services, and obviously there are challenges in this case. In terms of reforming the gender recognition process, my understanding is there will be some changes to the proof requirement that previously was in relation to proving that you lived for 2 years in your acquired gender, and there will be changes around that in terms of it being a cooling off period or a period in which you have spent 2 years considering, because it's a very important and significant step to undertake the process of
I don't understand how that will be made easier if it's still 2 years.
Changing the proof requirements, that's the main change that will be brought through.
Do you think this process should be made easier?
So I have to admit, uncharacteristically, that I approached this subject with more than usual humility and a desire to learn and understand. And I thought that both the points that Stephen and Tamandra made are important points. What I think is necessary here is a deep understanding and tolerance of people who are caught in the front line of this. And Stephen is also right that, in general, members of Parliament tread softly when something is before the courts, as it is today. But what I would say is I am very concerned indeed that biologically born women should be able to have confidence in women-only spaces, and also that on sports issues we should take a sensible and pragmatic view.
All right, let's talk about housing, because a new BBC documentary called Evicted, Tenants on the Edge, is out on the BBC iPlayer. Now, the latest episode, and we saw examples of it in the headlines, is looking at the renting situation in Scotland after an eviction ban brought in during the pandemic was lifted in the spring. The first clip you're going to see is of a tenant called Skye, who has received an eviction notice from her landlord 5 days after the ban was lifted. Let's take a look.
Babe, you need to turn the toilet on. I should never have to say that sentence.
Today, Skye's got an appointment with an advisor to discuss her eviction.
I'm freaking out because I don't know what they're going to say.
And this isn't just about the law. For Skye, this is personal.
It affects me massively because I was homeless as a child and we had to live in a hotel for 4 months. So I know how it feels like, you know, to be a child and be in that situation and watch my mum in that situation. We went from temporary accommodation to temporary accommodation. I was getting moved primary school every other month. Like, I don't want that for him. I refuse to have that for him. Absolutely not.
Her landlord's letter has given Skye 3 months to leave her home.
Oh, I should take that letter, actually. This is the letter I had to send the landlord regarding the repairs. And I know she got this because I had to send it by recorded delivery, so she had to sign it when she received it. So I've got all the proof, like, I'm ready for this war. We're not leaving our house. We're not leaving our house.
Stephen, why are tenants still getting evicted despite ending no-fault evictions?
So obviously, firstly, the case that you've highlighted there is a deeply distressing one, because it's a young family who are going to be removed from their home, and that's not great to see. In terms of the law and as it stands at the moment, obviously landlords do have the ability to move people on under special criteria, and the landlords obviously thought to go down that area. But I think all of us who've seen bits of the show would be deeply disappointed at the fact that some landlords continue to go down a route where they're not doing repairs, where they're not looking after their tenants in a specific fashion. And it looks like certainly the individual who's involved there is doing the right thing by making sure that they have the advice and support necessary to fight the case as they see fit.
So actually, ending no-fault evictions, as you did in Scotland in 2017, isn't having the desired effect, is it?
Well, I think you can't be in a position, and I think it would be unreasonable to create a law which says that someone can stay in a rented property forever. Someone's got to have the ability to determine whether they want to sell it or so on.
But you just said that's a very unfair situation, but the law...
It may well be the case. I don't know the specifics. It may well be the case a landlord wants to move in into
wants
that
to sell
property,
or whatever.
Want to sell or whatever.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we can escape from that fact. But what we have done in Scotland is make sure that renters are protected by introducing rent caps, which has been, by the way, opposed by all our political opponents. And there's been some movement of that in late in relation to CPI +1, which I think is a reasonable measure in order to meet the needs of landlords, but also to protect tenants in what is extremely challenging circumstances.
What were you going to say, Andrew?
Well, I was going to say there's a debate going on, particularly in the Labour Party, I think, between the left, who believe that rent controls are the right answer to make progress on this, and I'm very pleased that Angela Rayner appears not to think that is the right route to go down, because we've seen what happens before when we do that. I mean, the big picture is we need to build more homes, and we're making our own contribution to that with 5,500 homes in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, and you know we have to have a balance that protects areas of natural beauty and green belts and so forth. But we do need to build more homes. But I think in terms of the internal debate about whether rent controls would help or not, I don't think they would.
Well, let's just put that partly to one side to go back to ending no-fault evictions, because looking at that example, and it is an example, Stephen's right, I mean, it could be for a landlord wanting to move in and so on and so forth, but do you see that actually banning no-fault evictions isn't going to end unfair situations where a tenant like Sky can be kicked out with moments' notice?
So, I mean, I'm pleased Andrew is on board with our approach in government, which is, yes, we want to end no-fault evictions. And, you know, I think where possible, we need to create a much fairer balance of power between landlords and tenants. And that's why we're bringing in changes to, you know, the right to demand good conditions, the, you know, much greater requirements on landlords to sort of manage the rent level as well, the way the market works, and to make sure that they can ensure a good condition of housing, and that you can't punish a tenant for raising concerns.
Well, you say you want
in relation to
you
that.
say you want to rebalance it.
But
Let me
fundamentally, as well, it is, and I agree with Andrew, it is about demand and supply
about building
challenges.
homes, but that's going to take some time. In the meantime, it's whether the legislation that's being proposed or passed, and the legislation that's already gone through in Scotland, whether it's working or not. Let's have a look at this from a landlord, David, who is reclaiming a property from a tenant.
Landlord David's tenant has been rehomed by the council, so he can finally enter his property. But he has no idea the condition it's been left in.
Hello? Hello? Jesus. Really? I've never seen so much rubbish in the one place. I don't even know how to describe that. I don't understand why people live like this, actually. It's a shame. So we're looking at new door, new kitchen, new bathroom. I reckon we're looking at easily 20 grand. And then I'll probably just sell it, to be honest. It's getting too difficult in the private rented sector. Governments are getting too involved. They're putting in too many controls. The margins are getting squeezed to the extent that it's getting to the point that it's not worth it.
Stephen, what did you say to that landlord?
Well, the flat's quite obviously a bit of a state, you know, a flat or a house. Now, I don't know the specific circumstances.
No, but too many regulations, too difficult. He's going to sell it.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know the specific circumstances of how the property's got in that condition. I would have thought, having been a tenant in the past myself, that there would have perhaps been observations done of the property during the residency. But when we're looking at some of the big challenges here that landlords face, I don't actually think the big issue here is whether there's CPI +1. I think the big issue for a lot of landlords is the fact that they're being squeezed because of interest rates. They're being squeezed because of the fact that the UK...
He says he said there was too much government interference and too much regulation. And if there aren't the properties there for people to rent, then rents are just going to continue to go up. But answering his question, what would you say?
But I'm not going to apologise for the fact that I believe that tenants should have rights and protections, but I also believe that landlords have responsibilities. But I don't think Andrew should be shaking his head at the fact that interest rates went absolutely through the roof, and a lot of landlords, as a result, are wanting to put up rents to such a level that nobody could afford them, so they're having to sell into the private market.
You have seen that every expert has said that as a result of Labour's economic policies, interest rates are likely to remain higher than they would have done otherwise.
Reality that we've inherited at the moment. You can't blame Labour for that mess. In terms of the rental market.
I'm dealing with Stephen's specific point about interest rates, but I don't want Catherine to get too overexcited by my assumed support. What you have to do in this situation is have a balance of rights between landlords so that they will want to keep their property in occupation and tenants so that they are treated properly and with respect. And if you get that balance correct, then more property will be on the market and the position will be much easier.
Is the balance correct?
Well, I don't think it is, but I think that's not so much because of the law. I think it's because of the shortage of housing. And in a landlord's market, because there are more tenants than there are properties, then it kind of doesn't matter what you do with the law, because the landlords are always going to be in a position to say, you know what, we'll rent it to somebody else. I was talking to a friend last night who's looking for somewhere to rent and said that a property was advertised at one price, and then the estate agent said, well, what are you going to offer us? And he said, well, I was going to offer you the price it's advertised at. And they're like, well, you're not going to get it if you give us what's advertised, because there's far more people than there are properties.
And that's the point I was making, that, you know, you can deal with the demand challenges, the rights of tenants, which absolutely I think we need to improve on, and we can do much more on through our legislation. But you have to deal with the supply side. And you say it'll take too long. I think, you know, we have moved as fast as we can.
It is too long, but it will take a while.
And you know, and that is a priority for us to really fix our housing market so that people, young people today, can aspire to own a home, and it doesn't all have to be built, you know, bought up by landlords, and also that there is a fair and decent rental market for tenants, so people who can't or don't want to own a property.
I'm going to bring you some breaking news on a completely different subject. Here is the headline from the BBC. Russia expels British diplomat over espionage claims, according to media reports. They've expelled a British diplomat after accusing him of espionage. The TASS news agency is citing the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, saying that the ministry has also summoned the British ambassador. There's been footage of the British ambassador's car pulling up to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Moscow. There's no immediate comment from the UK Foreign Office or the British Embassy in Moscow. Do you want to respond, Andrew?
I don't think I can without knowing more about what has happened. But these allegations, in my experience of time in the Foreign Office, are normally spurious.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to respond. I would suggest that if the Russians are saying something, we probably don't believe it until our own officials have been able to provide us with clarity.
Let's look at this headline in the Times. This is on assisted dying, the big debate, a critical debate going on at the moment in Parliament. There is an important vote on Friday for parliamentarians. Labour Rift as peer says keep religion out of assisted dying debate. Lord Faulkner of Thoroton has been accused of mounting a drive-by shooting on Shabana Mahmood, who is opposed to the legislation. Do you agree with Lord Faulkner, Catherine, that religion should be out of this debate on assisted dying?
What I absolutely fundamentally disagree with is the characterisation of this as some kind of rift. It is a conscience vote. It is a matter for individual MPs to vote on according to their own conscience, their view, taking a look at legislation which, in all honesty, in terms of this process, we haven't had long to scrutinise. And so I think it's really important that we, you know, like many issues, take a respectful approach to this debate. And I think that, you know, people have expressed their views. The government is very clear that it takes a neutral position. And as a government minister, I respect that on this vote.
So you haven't decided how you're going to vote? You haven't said?
So I will say, in previous vote, when it came to Parliament, I voted against. And so, I will look very carefully ahead of Friday. I have listened to constituents' views. Yep. It's an incredibly emotive debate. And my consideration actually is for the new MPs in Parliament who are just getting to grips with how to get to the chamber on time and make it on time to vote.
So
because
this is a matter of conscience complex, for you?
That actually we need to conduct this debate really respectfully.
Well, is Lord Faulkner conducting it respectfully by saying keep religion out of this because he thinks the Justice Secretary has clearly brought it into the debate?
No, it is by definition a conscience vote. Right. That's how you describe a free vote of MPs to vote on a matter that they can personally decide. And there's a reason why these really important fundamental decisions, and we have, we've had various of them in the time I've been in Parliament, and they are not easy. And I wouldn't ever underestimate how difficult it is for MPs to make these decisions because
we know we've had endless
we have to listen to our constituents and listen to our own conscience as well. And I think that's really important to give the space for that too.
Right. So it's a matter of conscience for you.
It's a conscience vote.
Yeah. What about for you, Andrew?
Well, it's a matter of conscience for everyone. And I think that what Charlie Faulkner is saying is perfectly sensible. He's done an enormous amount to drive this issue forward. And as the former co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on dignity in dying, I am going to vote for the bill. I think that it's very important that Parliament now decides. Law has been made here by sort of creeping decision-making by judges, by the DPP, by others as well. It is for us, as the elected members of Parliament. We've all just been through a long and bruising election. We've been elected. It's our duty now, on behalf of our constituents, to decide the answer to this. And it's been being discussed for endless years.
So do you agree? But do you agree with him that religion should be kept out of the debate?
Well, I think
that's what I'm trying to get.
I think he's got a very good point in what he's saying. What he's saying is that as members of Parliament, we have got to exercise our judgment on behalf of all our constituents, regardless of whether they are religious or not.
Right.
And on Friday, remember, we will not be voting for the concluded and refined bill. We will be voting for the principle. Something like 80%, between 70 and 80% of our constituents want this bill to go through. On Friday, we will have the chance to exercise our judgment as to whether, in principle,
yes,
this is the right way to proceed.
Will you be voting on this, Stephen?
It's very unlikely that I'll be voting on it because the matter, as you know, is devolved to the Scottish Parliament. I don't believe that I should be telling people in England and Wales what should happen with end-of-life care, just as English MPs can't have a vote in Scotland.
Fine. Just to be clear, that's all we have time for today. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 11:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Do join me then. Bye-bye.